We are now in the second era amidst the swamps and the decaying grandeur of the Black Marsh. And we have a war being waged, a vicious conflict that would need to be achieved in the ancient dream of unifying the Black Marsh. And from her throne of bones and petrified wood in Norg-Tzel, the Lich Queen Nasa Karasa watches the campaign unfold, her ambition cold and constant in the void of her undead heart. And this war would not just be for territory, but it was a step in a chain that will culminate in the restoration of the High Kingdom of the Black Marsh, and a kingdom reborn embracing the ways of the Ghost Hist and ruled by death. Every league gained was a stone laid in that foundation of her empire. And her current adversaries, a coalition of living tribes in Thorn Marsh, were an infuriating obstacle, and their commander a slippery and vexing creature who refused to engage in battle and would act in the form of feints and retreats. And for weeks, her legions would be chasing smaller, faster armies along the coast, in this frustrating game that would fray her patience. And her forces, of course, a mix of humble, heavy-bodied Argonians and undead warriors, were built for overwhelming assault, but this constant use of pursuit was bleeding her resources, and now she was faced with the siege in her own lands while she goes and achieves the war goal itself. And in this recent attempt to break the stalemate, and goaded by the enemy's evasiveness, she, Nasa, would order a direct amphibious landing intended to slam the enemy's flank and pin them against the sea, but it was a move that failed spectacularly. And the living had anticipated this maneuver and would turn the beaches into a quagmire of hidden traps and relentless arrow fire, and her forces would be decimated before they could even form ranks. And this setback was, of course, a stinging reminder that the enemy was cunning in all lacks of other forms of wisdom. And Nasa had miscalculated, and she would not forget the shame. And the war had now entered a perilous phase. The main host was finally mooching in to join the conflict and threatened to crush Nasa's army with sheer numbers. And this was, of course, the beginning of the true test itself. It would be in moments like these of strategic tension that Nasa would borrow an idea from the fleeting races of Tamriel, and she had read it in the captured texts in the histories of men, a duty of chronicles, the preservation of life's narrative as a shield against the oblivion of time. And the living would do this out of fear of being forgotten. But Nasa's motivations were different. For being beyond death, memory was not a treasure to be cherished, but to be cataloged and weaponized. And in this journal, it would not be a plea to be remembered, but it would be a book of memory, like a ledger. It would be a precise account of her actions and her triumphs and, of course, her mistakes. It was a way for her to retain order in the chaos of conquest and refine her works until they were perfect. And Nasa began to write. Her script sharp and angular, and she did not write of feelings or passions, but of logistics, troop movements, and strategic objectives. And that failed beach assault was dissected with precision, examining it as a failed experiment. Hypothesis. Overwhelming force applied to a directly mobile and inferior foe across in the boats results in disproportionate attrition, variable beachfront, variable desperation, Conclusion, the living do not break when cornered, and they will bite and lay traps. The acts of chronicling was her new habit. It was like a ritual, and it would purge the residue of frustration and replace it with her analyses. And her war was now but a problem and a theorem that she would find a solution for. And her end goal and result would be an absolute. And the path to it was a series of equations waiting to be solved. And her primary variable was the enemy's numbers and capabilities. And her forces would lock up in sieges against the fortresses. But as the tide of the main army would draw closer, she would need to begin to shift the balance of power, and her gaze would drift towards the scurrying pool of water. Swirling with large images, she would see her commanders and her skeletal forces impassive. But also she saw the translucent forms of her dearly departed spy master, a recent casualty among the skirmishes, now bound to her will. And they would deliver reports that lacked the detail and insight that he possessed in life. Of course, his death, such an inconvenience. You should have anticipated that ambush. Your replacement will need to be more attentive. And her thoughts would turn to reinforcements, and her power will reach deep into the bedrock of the marsh, in its pits and the mass graves in her domain. And with will, she could summon more undead, and it would be immediate in and of itself. Hundreds of Argonians could be risen at a moment's notice, but the ritual would drain her and leave her reserves critically low. But of course, there lie other options. One that would fill her with intellectual contempt, and she considered the possibility of hiring mercenaries. In and of itself, the living, of course, would be very eager to throw their lives away for her cause, but she could not afford to hire the more reputable and effective sellsword companies. And the thought of hiring cheap, unreliable brutes was dismissed instantly, for incompetence was not a luxury she could afford. And the debt, oh, the debt. A promise written in ink could always be repaid in blood. She was willing to go into debt to leverage the future spoils of her kingdom. But then a sudden flurry of activity in the scrying pool snapped her attention back, and in a messenger, one of her thralls was kneeling before her, pointing frantically. The enemy they had been chasing for weeks had made a critical error, and in their haste they had linked up with the main host, and they would have retreated into a poorly defensible position. They were exposed, vulnerable, and in the raising of her own forces, they could be crushed before the larger armies could arrive, but she needed more troops immediately on the beachfront. And the thought came, of course, let us raise the undead and summon the villagers nearby who have been untouched by the fighting, and its people could be conscripted and thrown into the gap to buy time. Marshal the living from the western swamps and form them on the coast. They will hold the line or die. And the order was a mere breath from being sent, but a thought, away becoming a death sentence for hundreds. And as the command would be unleashed, a vision had come clear and claimed her consciousness. It was 1,000 variables itself that passed for her mind, and she saw terrified levies, their ranks ragged and breaking. And she saw the enemy's main host, not days away as her commanders believed, but hours cresting upon the hill. And she saw the charge and slaughter and the complete collapse of her flanks as the levies would be swept away. And in the sheer fallibility of her subordinates, this weakness would not be allowed, and she would obey another order, not as a shout, but an ice-like through her psychic connections. Belay the order and pull back. And of course, miles away, her captains would raise their hands and stop the levies from marching to their graves. In the logical vision of her own defeat fading, she will look back into the future and see that this war would not be won by throwing numbers and hordes of men, but by the act of the supreme will. And she would turn back to her pool and saw that she would need to levy however she could. And as the enemies were haunting her gates and pressing forward to take the siege of the capital, she would summon her horde in from the depths itself to hold the army off and give our enemies time to collapse. And in the end, it would be a magnificent battle. And our armies would retake Norg-Tzel before the siege could be complete. The air over Norg-Tzel still tasted of ozone and decay. In the aftermath of the raw power that NASA unleashed to defend her capital, the assault had been repelled and the enemy thrown back from her gates, but the exertion had left her spent, and now her reserves were completely depleted, and she felt hollow. And that vulnerability itself was one that she despised. And now her army and her recent siege against Rock's Part was exposed. They had already previously secured the objective, but the main host, enraged and engaged, had now resecured the objective. And a direct confrontation would be annihilation. And the war, despite her recent victory, was now teetering on the edge. And from her stratum, she would observe the situation from the scrying pool. And the calculations here were simple. Her forces were inefficient and her power was exhausted. And in her previous moment of hiring mercenaries, now was the time to execute. And the army that she would require would be the Black Fin mercenaries. With their reputation for savagery and greed, she would send the order and commence the last of her treasury to the contract. And now all she could do was wait and pray that the captain was not a fool. The mercenaries would arrive, but not as planned. It was through a logistical error of some sorts. It was not the Blackfin mercenaries, but rather hiring the Deep March Bloodscales. And this was not the only cause of error that would occur in the hiring of these mercenaries. Instead, the mercenaries would not rise with the main army in the proper place, but rather they would rely on the opposite side of the enemy host, and then they were left as a vulnerable set of living flesh between the hammer of the enemy and the anvil of the impassable swamp itself. And for a single frozen moment, a fissure of rage would crack among Nasa's composure, but the blunder was not completely lost. And as the philosopher's mind would reassert control, she would begin to calculate that this disaster could be saved by the mere act of survival amongst the mercenary corps itself. And the enemy commander was a man of predictable passions, and he would not be able to resist the temptation of a quick and easy victory, and he would see these isolated mercenaries as morsels to be devoured, and he would give chase, and in his haste, he would overextend his forces and abandon his formidable defensive position on the mainland. And as if enacting the script, the enemy commander would take the bait, and the great host would turn its attention away from sieging to a thunderous pursuit of this small company. And the captain of the Blood Leech would need to prove his worth, and he understood the situation with an instance. He would not try to fight in an act of folly against the mercenaries, the main force itself. Instead, he would run. He would run until he could hope not to escape no more and avoid capture from this main army. And Nasa would watch from the scrying pool with rapt attention, like a predator observing its prey being led into the snare. And in this display of tactful kiting, it was a testament of the sellsword captain's nerve in and of itself. And the chase would be agonizingly long. Several times the enemy would nearly catch them, their vanguard clashing in skirmishes in the murky twilights of the swamp. But each time the leeches would slip away and draw their pursuers deeper into the landscape, further and further from their objective and the supply lines. Dance, little mortals! Dance for your queen! And then the trap would eventually spring, and they would complete a great circle, and the exhausted mercenaries would emerge from the swamp exactly where Nasa had predicted, right beside her own main army who had been waiting, silent and still. The two forces would merge into one, and from that merging, it would be a great battle, and the main army would be caught, disoriented, and out in the open. And they would no longer be the hunter, but the prey, trapped between the might of the Legion and the unforgiving Marsh. And the battle that followed would not be a battle at all, but instead an execution. And Nasa's forces would fall upon the enemy's flanks, and the great host, who was once so intimidating, would be shattered into that of a panicked peace sect. And the victory would be absolute, and the war would not be won by numbers, but by manipulating the enemy's aggression and turning an error into a solution. And the final siege would be broken, and the lands of Rockport would be annexed, and it would be another step onto the grand ambitions of the unification of the Black Marsh itself. The war for Rockport was won, and the banner of the White Queen now flew over its soil and added another piece to the growing work of her domain of Norg-Tzel. But the victory was financed by a debt, and it was a stain on the ledgers of the kingdom. But Nasa Karasa knew that the solution was in the flesh that she had already taken, along with the land itself, and her dungeons had held the most valuable spoils of her past campaigns, and it is the captured son and heirs of the defeated tribes themselves, and they were her treasury. And she would call forth the audience, and emissaries desperate to reclaim their kin would kneel before the bone throne, and Nasa would parade the prisoners before the local tribesmen, and their faces gaunt and their spirits broken. And the stench, oh the stench, the torture before her whisper, cold and dry as the grave dust itself, would slither across the hall to the emissaries. You value these prisoners, and their worth to me could be for some, or they could be mounted as stoles for my harvest, but the sum has been declared and you will pay it in full. There was no room for haggling here. The coffers of the defeated would be emptied into hers, and the gold would wash and clean the kingdom's debts, and her finances would be secure once again, and her attentions would turn to the mundane world of economics and look back to the martial and political realm as well. It would be in small periods of peace that the queen would observe the training of her warriors, and during such successions like those, startling event would occur, and a simple footwoman, a local Argonian, would spar with Nasa. She at first dismissed her as a fool, but it became quickly apparent that she was a warrior of shocking ferocity, and her strikes would be wild and vicious, like the swamp Wamu's dragons itself. And the spar would not be just a drill, but a life of genuine struggle, a matter of life and death. And of course, Nasa would eventually, with desperation, disarm the woman and clatter her sword to the ground. Nasa would stand over the prattling warrior and would consider her options. This woman, of course, dangerous and a great threat. Killing her would be of simple recourse. But to destroy such talent would be a waste. And instead, we would focus and aim that ferocity at our enemies. She would keep this warrior and take her into her personal guard to be honed and used. And of course, these incidents would allow her to rule with a ruthless level of efficiency, but let's not forget the heart of Norg-Tzel itself that had allowed Nasa to quickly expand across the lands of the Black Marsh, for while the other local lords had regular tents and hovels, and of course Nasa did not have a castle of her own, she did have a significant temple in her hut, and it was called Zinemir, but it was also something more, a lost laboratory to the legendary sorcerer Balakar. And the chronicles in this temple, as she dived in and would research and look, it would describe a genius, a master of magic whose knowledge would be unrivaled in Argonian civilization. And Balakar had transformed Zinemir of Norg-Tzel into a nexus of research that now she uses to her full privilege. And this laboratory would be dedicated to advancing the welfare of his people through magical innovation. And for a time, it was a beacon of progress and wisdom. But for Balakar's ambition, it was, however noble, was tethered to the mortal heart. And it was through love, when his beloved wife died, that his grief would shatter his altruism and turn his resource to the forbidden itself. And he would plunge into the art of necromancy, desperately searching for ways to cheat death and bring her back. And this laboratory that was once a place of light was a sanctuary of shadow filled with forbidden experiments in the scent of the decay. And Nasa, of course, would feel this kinship, and maybe, just maybe, Nasa may have been this long-lost wife that he had sought to bring back from the grave. He had failed, of course, because he was bound by love and grief. And Nasa may just be the very woman that he was trying to revive. These details we would never know. And the local populace who had once revered him would grow terrified of his work. And they would rose up and lay siege to the laboratory. But Balakar's genius was such a foundation that his power remained and was infused in the very stones, and the ruins would offer incredible possibilities for study. Nasa, not knowing how her own existence came into play, was living and of course operating from here, the most powerful arcane nexus ever constructed, and one of the few places where education could be held at the highest level. She inherited a massive place and a great starting point for the greater kingdom, and with this understanding of her capital, She would review the map and look, and then she would see that it's now time. From an administrative standards, this queen was not a queen, but rather a countess among the nobility of Tamriel. And she had obtained much land, and soon she would have to distribute the rest. And she would grant her land out as by law, but could not do it carelessly. There must be steps. She could not just grant land casually. She had to ascend to the next level. To dish out titles so easily would dismantle her own kingdom. So now she would now become a duchess and grant and build the commonplace states. And she would gain more, of course, but even as she would reorganize her kingdom, her path to conquest would soon be hampered, and the truces that she signed with her neighbors would be ironclad and carry significant consequences if she were to continue her push. And now she would walk on a different path, beyond the ways of a conqueror but back to being a predator itself. And she would issue a decree from her throne and summon her legions to bleed her neighbors from the distant lands dry and claim loot to bring back to the home front. Their treaties protect their borders but not their wealth, and their peace is a shield. We will raise our reavers and engage and loot all their farms and the castles and burn every storehouse and take gold from all those. Our ascension requires money, and our neighbors will provide.